Good morning. Welcome to the Humanist community in Silicon Valley's Sunday Forum. My name is Matt Courtney, and I am the recorder and a member of the board of the Humanist community. The Humanist community is a chapter of the American Humanist Association. Humanism is a reality-based philosophy of life that affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good. We value freedom, health, happiness, fairness, compassion, and using science and reason to acquire and apply knowledge. If these words describe your thinking, we invite you to become a member of the Humanist community if you have not already joined. Membership forms are available on our website at humanists.org. That's humanists plural. So our speaker today is Dr. Charles Courtney, who's Professor Emeritus of the College of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Florida. And of course, most importantly, my dad. He'll be talking about the statistics of diagnostic testing. There we go, a nice short interview. So, Dad, you're unmuted. You can go ahead and get started.
All right, I'm gonna pop these up. Okay. Today, oops, do this. There we go. I'm going to talk about diagnostic testing and some of the statistics associated with it, and try to impress upon you that diagnostic tests, while a good thing, can very easily be abused in their interpretation. And I really want to hammer on that pretty hard and make sure you understand it, because with this COVID going around and all the talk about testing, people tend to get too excited about stuff that isn't going to work and stuff that's being simply overhyped. I will very briefly mention COVID, and most of that information comes from a friend who is retired from the University of Florida's Health Science Center and was an epidemiologist physician with them and is very knowledgeable on this. So remember, I'm a veterinarian. I will have to use a couple of veterinary examples illustrating my points further in. I will also use a couple of made-up examples related to COVID, since that's kind of on everybody's mind. So without further ado, let me get into the talk itself. Just a real brief overview of diagnostic tests for COVID-19. There are basically two different classes of tests used for two different purposes. A nucleic acid test, and the exact name of it is a reverse transcriptase PCR, looks for the presence of COVID-19 virus. The purpose of this test is to detect whether or not you are currently infected and therefore have the potential to get sick if you're not already sick, and have the potential to infect somebody. These tests, when done correctly, are very, very accurate. They just takes a lot of care and some expensive machinery, and it takes some time to do it right. There has been a lot of work and hype about rapid tests, and so far any of these rapid tests that give results within an hour or so just don't stand up to the PCR test in terms of performance. The other class of tests that's used for COVID-19 diagnostics is the antibody test. It looks for the antibodies formed by the body in response to a prior COVID-19 infection. It gives you evidence of prior exposure to and recovery from the COVID-19 virus. The problem is everybody and their brother is trying to come up with an antibody test. There are quite a few of them out there right now. The vast majority of them have not been reviewed and approved by the Food and Drug Administration, although FDA is now cracking down on that. Many of these tests are inaccurate. Some of them are wildly inaccurate. According, again, to my physician friend, he only trusts the current test from Abbott Labs and one from Roche. And there's one that looks pretty darn good from Mount Sinai Hospital up in New York. And those are really the only ones that he has any degree of faith in. He says, assume all the others are bad until proven otherwise. Okay, well, so much for COVID-19. I want to talk a little bit about the correct use of a couple of terms. So if we got any English teachers in the audience, you'll appreciate this. An individual is either infected or uninfected or not infected with a disease agent. A test result is positive or negative, although in some situations a test result can be considered equivocal. So what does this mean? It's incorrect to say that person is corona positive. The strictly correct language, again for the English teachers among us, that person tested corona positive, or that person is corona infected. And I can get off my bully pulpit with respect to that. Now I need to make a few definitions. First of all, what is a positive result? Well, a positive result is the test gives you something that says positive, but there are two kinds of positive results, a true positive and a false positive. A true positive is a positive test result from an infected individual. However, if an infected individual were to give a negative test result, that's a false negative. Conversely, a true negative is a negative test result from an uninfected individual, and a false positive is a positive test result from an uninfected individual. And these four items are what we build upon in working up our statistics. So it's now time for some simple mathematics. First of all, there are two things that we characterize when we're looking at a new diagnostic test. We try to establish its sensitivity and its specificity. The sensitivity of a test is the proportion of positive test results that come from a group of infected individuals, and it's typically expressed as a percentage. So it's the number of true positives over the number of true positives plus false negatives. Remember, false negatives are infected individuals that gave a negative test result. Specificity is the proportion of negative test results from a group of uninfected individuals. True negatives divided by true negatives plus false positives. That is, uninfected individuals that gave you an incorrect positive result. Again, expressed typically as a percentage. Sometimes the words accuracy are used with respect to a test, and I will actually use it a little later on. It's not my favorite term to use because of some issues with it. But in general, the accuracy of a test is described as the proportion of correct test results, whether positive or negative, from a group that includes both infected and uninfected individuals. So you have true positives plus true negatives. Okay, those are your correct results, divided by everybody that you tested, and then express it as a percentage. This is probably one of the two most important parameters when we're dealing with statistics and diagnostic testing. This is where a lot of stuff falls down. That is the predictive value of a positive test. It's sometimes called positive predictive value. The predictive value of a positive test is that proportion of all positive test results that came from individuals infected with the disease agent. This is definitely not the same as sensitivity. This is the number of true positives divided by all positive test results, true and false, expressed typically as a percentage. Likewise, we have a predictive value of a negative test, which is the proportion of all negative test results that came from proportion of all negative test results that came from truly negative individuals. So it's true negatives over all negatives expressed as a percentage. The problem is many of these parameters are not very constant. Some are more constant than others. Some of them are highly variable depending on the circumstances in which they're used. And this is the important concept to get. Let's start with sensitivity. In some systems, sensitivity can be affected by just the strain. You develop a test for some organism that occurs in Africa, and somehow it got into the US, and you're now testing for it in the US. It's very possible that thing is mutated a bit in the process of coming to a new land and getting established in a new land from a very small, what we call a founder population. And as a result, it may differ just enough that the test either doesn't work at all or works at a reduced sensitivity. In the case of immunologic or serologic tests, the antigen may be somewhat different. In the case of a test that uses nucleic acids, such as a PCR test, the nucleic acid sequence that's being looked at may be slightly altered, and that would affect the test results. For the most part, this is not a big problem compared to some of the others we run into. Sensitivity can also be affected by the magnitude of infection in some cases. Again, it depends on the system you're testing, but if you don't have enough either antigen, antibody, or nucleic acid present, the test may give you some false results, false negative results, for example. Now, where sensitivity and specificity differ wildly from one another, maybe you have a test that's 95% sensitive, but only 75% specific. Overall accuracy, but the term accuracy, and this is why I don't like that term, becomes variable. When the prevalence of infection is high, when most everybody you're testing has the disease, accuracy will approach sensitivity because most all of the tests are run against infected individuals, and that's whatever the number is for accuracy, for sensitivity is going to be the predominant number in that calculus. However, if the prevalence of infection is low, accuracy will approach the stated value for specificity. So accuracy typically falls somewhere between, overall accuracy of a test, I should say, falls somewhere between specificity and sensitivity, somewhere between those two numbers, depending on the prevalence of infection in the population being tested. Now, it gets even worse with predictive values, quite a bit, because not only do they vary with prevalence of disease, but they also vary with the sensitivity and specificity of the test, such that the predictive value of a positive test decreases as the prevalence of disease decreases, unless the specificity is 100%. It never misses to detect an infected individual. Likewise, the predictive value of a negative test decreases as the prevalence of disease increases, unless sensitivity is 100%, that it never calls a false positive. Here is an example of it graphically. I'm assuming just a hypothetical test that has a sensitivity of 90% and a specificity of 98%. This is not way out of line for a lot of these sorts of diagnostic tests. If you look and see at the bottom scale, which is the prevalence of infection in that population, anywhere from 0 on the left to 100% infection on the right. By the way, COVID-19 is usually less than 5% prevalence. With a test with these numbers, which is pretty darn good actually, by most tests, look what happens to the predictive value of a positive test when you get to the low end of that prevalence scale, which is the situation with COVID-19. A positive test may not necessarily mean a lot unless it's got a really, really good specificity. Likewise, a negative test goes down as the prevalence of infection gets very high. So at the extremes of population, of prevalence of disease in a population, at either extreme, the tests start to become somewhat unreliable in their ability to predict things. And it's really important that you be aware of the limitations. Now, the good news is when prevalence is high, a test that's positive becomes extremely meaningful, very likely to be correct. When prevalence is very low, if you get a negative test result, you can have a very high degree of confidence in it. But the opposite is also true. Now let's look again at that hypothetical test. 90% sensitive, 98% specific. If we test 100 individuals from a Navy vessel, such as the recent aircraft carrier that was having a coronavirus outbreak, and we'll say, for this example, 50% of the personnel are infected with the virus, and we're using the test that actually, we're going to use a test that detects current infection, the virus. We have a 90% sensitivity times 50 infected individuals. So you multiply that out, and that's going to give you 45 true positives and 5 false negatives. All right? Now let's look at specificity. It's 0.98. 50 individuals gives you 49 true negatives and 1 false positive. The predictive value of a positive test in that case You can look it out, 45 true positives over 45 true positives plus one false positive. If you got a positive test, you're 98% certain that individual is currently infected with, in this case, coronavirus. However, we test 100 individuals from a rural county way out in the boondocks where the prevalence of infection is only 1%. Run the numbers again, 90.9 sensitivity times one infected individual out of 100. You'll get one true positive. I'm going to be generous and say with 0.9, we detected the infected guy. No false negatives. Specificity, 0.98 times 99 uninfected individuals, 97 true negatives, 2 false positives. Predictive value of a negative test, pretty darn good in that situation, but predictive value of a positive test is awful. One true positive over one true positive plus 2 false positives. If you have a positive test result, you're only 33% or 1/3 chance that that person is really infected. And what happened here is where the prevalence of infection was so very low, there were just so many more opportunities for a false positive to occur than a true positive. And as a result, the really good specificity of that test was just simply overwhelmed stochastically. They just too many chances for it to go wrong in the testing process. You need to remember that all of these tests, just nobody's perfect. In contrast, on that naval vessel where the prevalence of infection was high, the opportunity for a false positive occur was about the same as for a true positive. And the results came out pretty good in that case. So the bottom line is you do not interpret diagnostic tests in a vacuum. You look at the entire clinical picture for these tests. You want to look and say, is this test result compatible with what I'm seeing? I mean, if I get a positive test from an ICU nurse that's been working with COVID-19 patients, yeah, you're going to be pretty confident that's a good result. Why? Because the prevalence infection in that population is really, really high. Predictive value of a positive test is really, really good. If I get a positive test from an astronaut that just came back from a year in the space station, pretty darn unlikely that they've been infected with COVID-19. I've got that positive test result's almost certainly false. What you do when you really suspect a false result, normally you wait a short time and retest just to be sure. But this would really be an alarm that, whoa, something's wrong with the test. Now, diagnostic tests undergo what's called optimization. Absent a big change in the technology, you end up having to balance sensitivity and specificity of a test to reflect the intended use of the test, because you're kind of stuck with a sensitivity and a specificity. You can change reagents, incubation times, little tweaks like that that'll make it more sensitive or more specific, and usually one comes at the cost of the other. In veterinary medicine, we test frequently for dog heartworm. I don't know how familiar you folks out there are with it, but it's a pretty nasty infection here in Florida with over half the dogs that are not protected with monthly medication. They're going to get it. The disease, when it occurs, it is expensive to treat, and there's considerable risk associated with the treatment itself. As a result, our diagnostic tests are optimized for specificity. We really, really don't want a false positive because the consequence of an unnecessary treatment is pretty severe. Now, we'll look at the other end of it. As a veterinarian, we always worry about the importation of a foreign animal disease, with foot and mouth disease being the classic example. We absolutely don't want to let that into the country, no matter what. And the tests that are used on imported animals are optimized for sensitivity. Who cares if a lot of cattle, a group of cattle stated to cross the border from Mexico into here and used for hamburgers or something, if they get rejected incorrectly, that's no big deal. That's nowhere near as damaging as letting an infected animal get into this country, because it would cost many millions of dollars, if not billions, to get the disease eradicated from this country again. So where there's a high economic cost of something entering the community, or in the case of human diseases, it may be something that's really scary. You really want a good test, and you don't worry about saying you can't come in the country, you might have it. And notice the word is you might have it. There's a problem we also call the gold standard problem. What constitutes a truly infected or a truly uninfected individual? We're looking for antigen, antibodies, pieces of nucleic acids, that sort of thing. But is that truly telling us the correct answer? And this is going to depend a lot on the objectives of the testing scheme. In many cases, you could use autopsy or culture to conclusively establish infection status. So the pathologist would go in and look at the cadaver, and yeah, this person, everything that I see is compatible with a coronavirus infection, everything that we're seeing in this cadaver. Or it may be that you grow out the virus, or in the case of a bacterial disease, the bacteria in some sort of a culture and identify that its presence that way. However, for many disease agents, you may never be able to absolutely determine, is that person truly infected? It's always a little bit of a gray area. So we need to think about the appropriateness of the gold standard when we're evaluating diagnostic tests. If a new diagnostic test comes along, what do you compare it to? The best previous test in a system where there's no clear gold standard? That may be the best we can do, but what do you do if the new test is positive and the old test is negative? How do we know which is truly correct if we don't have a real good gold standard to refer back to? So that can become problematic. The good news with COVID-19 is that PCR test, that's a pretty darn good gold standard. It doesn't miss much. So it gives us a good base to start from. Sometimes testing can be done in two stages to strike a balance between cost, speed, and accuracy. We may first run a less expensive but very rapid test, and it may not be particularly accurate, but it may be sort of accurate pretty much enough. But the thing is, it's cheap and it can be run quickly. And then we end up with a collection of individuals that we become interested in because they may have tested positive if it was a disease we're trying to diagnose, or they may have tested negative in the case of those foreign animal diseases, and we want to make really sure they're negative. In this case, we would follow up selected individuals based on this first test result by a second test that is typically slower and more expensive, but is extremely accurate. And we would base that on the results of the first test. So test one, negative, we don't worry about it. Positive, well, they might be infected. Then we run the more expensive test, and oh yeah, they really are infected, or oops, they weren't. And that's a very good strategy to use when we need to balance cost, speed, and accuracy. And that's pretty much all I had to say. This talk went a little quicker than I thought, Matt.
We have a question from the chat. I don't see anybody have their hands up yet, but from the chat, Jeff Justice is asking the specificity and sensitivity of the Abbott, or I guess it's Roche tests?
Yeah, I saw those numbers. Sensitivity was in the 90s and specificity was way up there, like 99%. If I remember the numbers, in a population with a prevalence of infection of 5%, the predictive value of a positive test was about 98%. So those were both pretty darn good. In comparison, some of the other tests on the market, their predictive value in that same population was down around 30-something percent, 38%, I think is the number for some of the other tests that are out there. That was one of the worst examples. And remember, the prevalence of COVID seems to vary well under that 5% mark. Here in Alachua County, Florida, we have 270,000 people in our county, and we have 360 some odd known infections. So you can run that number. That's a very low prevalence.
Yeah. Okay, so it looks like I saw a hand up from, it's like Roy. I tried to unmute you, but...
There, am I ready? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Yeah, I want to mention another diagnostics, but it also can have a treatment, I think. When I was 45, many years ago, I had I'm 90 now, so half my life. I had a very sore left arm, and it was swelling, and so I thought maybe it was even clear down to the bone. So I went to an orthopedist, and he gave me a test for bacteria, and he says it's not any bacteria. I suspect it's a non a virus that's not the same thing as for the lungs. It's a virus in the muscle or the ligament tissue. And so he used ultrasound, high intensity, and a few treatments, 15 minutes apiece, and it went away forever. So I thought about a month ago I'd look and see if they're using high intensity for COVID, and there was no connection. They did have diagnostics using ultrasound, but I thought that possibly, and also there's the opposite end of ultrasound, which is infrasound, which is low frequency. And I don't see any attempts to use the high intensity, such as over the chest, to stimulate the alveoli, the little bubbles in the lungs, and there is just no connection. Every time I looked at, and I've also written to several people emails, and they never answered. So I'm just curious if ultrasound or infrasound could be used as a treatment at the high intensity level.
Don't know. It's way out of my field of expertise. I'm sure everything that's, lots of stuff has been tried. Probably a lot of stuff that shouldn't have been tried. And we got only one or two items that look promising. I think that one antiviral drug seems to have some promise. And also using, I'm trying to think of what else, anticoagulants, because there's some evidence that when this thing goes systemic, it causes clotting in places where it shouldn't. The people that are on anti-cholesterol and anticoagulant drugs tend to suffer less from the condition.
Maybe, yes, maybe
nothing physical stuff like
to break those things up, the coagulant.
I'm sorry.
I think maybe the ultrasound addressed properly could break up blood clotting.
It might, but it's way out of my field of expertise, so I'll take a pass on that.
Well, why don't you check with somebody that knows about ultrasound? I can't find anybody that will talk to me about ultrasound to see if they've tried it. I would help if you could touch base on somebody that you're aware of that may know about this.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
All right. Alex?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. When you describe the antibody test, you indicated if the antibodies are there, you've had the disease and you've developed probably an immunity. So it sounds like the assumption there is that once the body develops an antibody, it's going to be cured in a short period of time. Is that correct? Are they that accurate? Are they that quick?
Again, there's just enough distortion at my end.
Oh, sorry about that. Let me try again. In the antibody test, the assumption seems to be if you've got the antibody, you had the disease, and you're now over it. Obviously, the antibody is developed to fight the disease. So is the assumption that once you develop the body develops an antibody, it will cure you in a short period of time?
It appears to be at least a major part of clearing the virus is the development of antibodies. What we don't know is how long any protection from having antibodies lasts. That's the big question. We know that you can transfuse antibodies from somebody who's recently recovered and has a high antibody titer. You can collect those from their blood and transfuse them into patients, and that appears to help them quite a bit. There's been some very good successes.
Okay, but the assumption is if you've got the antibodies, it's not going to take 2 months to actually recover from the disease.
I'm not aware. There may have been a case or two where they still had some antibodies and the presence of virus, but that was probably somebody right on the cusp of recovery, is what I would guess was going on.
Okay.
There are some people that have, quote, recovered and are still shedding virus, just a few. So there's always the odd outlier, it seems, in these things.
Okay. Also, the other test, if you're actually testing for the virus itself or signs of the virus, is there a minimum count? Is there a number below which you assume that it's not really an infection, or it's?
Well, I think it's whether they can detect it or not. Is what they're saying. Then the negative test, although if you're using that PCR, it's called a reverse transcriptase, real-time PCR. That's pretty darn good as long as there's no contamination involved. And if it's negative, there could be really, really small amounts, I guess, of virus that you could miss, but PCR can detect incredibly small quantities. That's the big advantage of it. What it does is PCR, the virus is what's called an RNA virus. Normally, all of us are genetic codes in DNA. It has to be transcribed to RNA, and then the RNA goes out and makes proteins. And that virus is so simple that it just got rid of the DNA somewhere in evolution and just uses RNA. Problem is with PCR, you can't directly multiply RNA. And all the PCR does is it heats up a sample that contains DNA. The DNA unwinds. Then you throw in what are called a bunch of primers that contains the gene sequence you're interested in. And then you cool it back down, and those little primers will join up and create some new strands. Then you heat it up and repeat the cycle over and over. And you keep making more and more new strands that contain just the gene sequence of interest. Everything else doesn't get duplicated because there's nothing else in there to really duplicate it well. It goes over and over and over, many, many cycles. Problem with RNA is you got to convert it to DNA first, and that's an enzyme called reverse transcriptase that'll make the backwards. So the RNA in the virus is converted by reverse transcriptase to DNA. Then the PCR test is run that amplifies the amount of DNA until you get a readable amount.
Okay, thank you.
It's not too vague, but that's basically what it does. But it's difficult. You got to be very, very careful of contamination. If you get the slightest contamination with that virus from some other source, it's going to amplify it. It'll amplify anything that it can see in there that matches the little primers you put in, the gene sequence of the primers. So what'll happen, they'll find a sequence that is unique to that virus, and then that is put into the system. And if the virus is present in the DNA that was transcribed from the RNA, then those primers start latching on and the whole thing multiplies over and over and over again. That's kind of a vague description. It's basically how it works. And the trick is finding the right gene sequence.
Okay, I'm going to go to Ray. Ray, you're
okay. Ray Sunby, thanks Charlie for your talk. Very interesting. I have a technical background. I've had a little bit of statistics and a couple questions. First one is related to antibodies and whether or not they predict that you're no longer contagious. I would think that when you start generating antibodies, at the very first you have some, but you still also have a lot of COVID virus, and then kind of a continuum, the antibodies build up and COVID virus goes down. And wondering if there's been any testing done that you're aware of how far this change from a few antibodies and lots of virus to lots of antibodies and no virus. Where in there can you say that a person is no longer contagious, or do you have to do the virus test to see if there's any virus left there?
My impression is that in general, the assumption is if you got a number of antibodies, you're okay, with the caveat that there are some edge cases, just right at that cusp of getting cured, where you may have virus and antibodies. But usually you know the history of that individual. I guess if you have somebody that's asymptomatic, so they never thought they had it, and they ran an antibody test and they got antibodies, you say, oh yeah, I must have had it and been over it. It's very possible that that person could be at that little gap in time when they got both virus and antibodies, but I would guess that's very low risk. And obviously, if somebody is known to have had the disease, you'd wait a sufficient time after recovery to check for antibodies. You wouldn't check like the day after they're let out of the hospital or something. You might wait a little longer.
Okay, and then the second question is, early in the talk and through the first part of it, you threw out a lot of terminology, prescriptive and accuracy and all those things, and it all kind of mushed together. And so I don't have a real clear picture of what's what there. But in terms of the actual state we're at in this epidemic, where we want to get people back to work, we want to do it as safely as possible, and testing is said to be necessary to be able to do that. In practical terms, could you talk a little bit about what you think the protocol should be for making this transition back to work and back to social interactions?
Out of my area of expertise, to remember I'm a veterinarian, not a physician, but in general, I can talk in general terms, I think. We're looking for a disease that in most populations around the U.S., it's not real common. We're, again, 5% or less, with a few exceptions. Therefore, we need to have a test that has a very high predictive value for a positive test. We need to know, we need to be confident that that person has it. We also need a pretty good predictive value for a negative test, which with a low population, that's usually pretty meaningful, unless the specificity is way off. So that's it's going to depend. What we need is high quality tests. More than anything else, we need, first of all, high quality tests. That's number one. Number two, we then need high quality tests that can be run on large populations quickly and hopefully cheaply. Without any of those, any mass population testing is going to become problematic. And we still have a problem with everybody and their brother trying to get an antibody test out there, because that's where the money's going to get made. They can be very profitable even at a fairly low price. And FDA is finally cracking down on that. I think they got so nervous they let stuff get by early on that shouldn't have. And now they're backtracking pretty quickly. Not a good answer, but I hope that helps.
That did help. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, we have Michael Abramson. Michael, you are unmuted. Are you still there? I guess he's not there. Okay, I remuted you. You're going to have to raise your hand again. Before I go on to Alex, there are a couple of questions in the chat. Okay. One was from Jeff Justice. Were PCR and the antibody tests done during the swine flu epidemic? I don't know if you know anything from back when that was going around.
With what was used during the swine flu epidemic, it wouldn't surprise. Well, let's see. That epidemic was in the late aughts, wasn't it? If I remember correctly.
Yeah, I think so.
PCR would have been available then, and serology would have been sufficiently advanced. I don't think there would have been a problem. They were probably using it.
Okay. Next one's a little more involved from Greg. That one is, can you comment on the Stanford study that appeared to show much higher infection rate in Santa Clara County than expected? I don't know if you heard about that one.
I'm aware of it, and I know my physician friend, physician epidemiologist friend, thought that it was a little bit much, that they were just, there were some issues with it, and off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly what the specific issues were, but I do know that it may have had something to do with the accuracy of the tests themselves that were being used at the time. But I can't remember for the life of me exactly what the complaint was, but he was not real impressed with that study. He thought it was overhyped.
Okay. Yeah, it sounded like some people were complaining that it might have had high false positive rate, which made it look like it was much higher rate of infection and made the disease look like it was far less deadly than thought.
And that was several months ago, wasn't it? And that was using an antibody test. Is that correct? I can't remember the details. And with an antibody test, the ones that were out several months ago were not very good at all.
Yeah, I can't remember if that one was an antibody test.
That's where the complaints come from. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to go back. There's another question there, but Alex has his hand up. So, Alex, you're good to go?
Yeah, I was wondering, it's probably less of a concern with animals, but when we're discussing how long an immunity lasts, are there after an epidemic goes by, is there a follow-up test on patients to see how long an immunity lasts, and how would that be performed?
I'm sorry, I did not hear the last part of that question again.
Oh, the last is there a follow-up test, and how would you perform a follow-up test to see if someone is still immune, other than trying to infect them?
You just repeat the test in a week or so and see if you get the same result. Ideally, I would,
antibodies.
Yeah, for example, if I tested a dog for dog heartworm, it came up positive, but it was a Fifi, the poodle that belonged to a little old widow lady who lived in a condominium in Miami, and her husband Sal died 3 years ago. That dog's her only companion. Nothing's too good for Fifi. I'm looking at a white toy poodle, overweight with bad teeth from too many treats, but she comes in and sees me every 6 months. Been on heartworm prevention. I'm looking at my records. They always had the 6-month supply bought every visit. There's just no reason for that dog to have heartworms. I'm going to doubt the result of that test. And what I will do is not only have her come back in a couple of weeks, I will make sure that the test I use is from a different test lot. And then I would watch my technician like a hawk. I would want to make sure that there's no technical error reason for that test to be positive. If it were to come back, say, a week positive again with a different lot, with a technician that I was personally overseeing, or a test that I ran myself, so I know it was done right, then I'd think, wow, maybe this is for real. So again, it's using your clinical judgment. You never look at a test result in a vacuum.
Okay, it's the immunity test you'd be looking at there then.
Again,
the antibody test.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're talking about the human antibody test for COVID-19. It's going to tell you right now, does that person have antibodies or not for COVID-19, is what that test tells you. If it comes up negative, it may mean you don't have antibodies. It's remotely possible the test was bad. Likewise, if the test became positive. That's why we need tests that have a high degree of accuracy, both in terms of sensitivity and specificity. If you'd repeat them, I would want to use another test, maybe even one from another company, not just another lot number of that test, if I had some reason to doubt the result of the test, if that's what you meant.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that the antibodies, if you're not reinfected, the antibody count will probably steadily reduce.
Okay, I'm getting, the audio is giving me a little trouble here. It doesn't help that my hearing's bad too.
Okay, I'm saying, so after you're infected and you get over it, you've got antibodies, but the level of antibodies probably goes down over time.
Yeah, they will. And we don't know how long immunity lasts. We don't even know how much immunity this confers. Presumably, if they've got antibodies and they recovered, there was enough antibody to affect the recovery. But then how long afterwards is it protective? All we know is there have been experiments and kind of desperate situations where antibodies were taken out of somebody that had recovered recently and put into somebody that was desperately ill, and they recovered. So we feel like the antibodies provide protection. We don't know for how long. We don't know if it's like a measles vaccine that lasts for decades, or if it's like an influenza vaccine that's not good for much more than a year or so, if that. We just don't know. And some antibodies are not protected, depending on the disease, for more than a month or so. We just don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, again, we got some more questions from the chat. I'm not sure if you can answer this, but Jeff Justice asks, can you comment on the Heinsberg antibody study?
No.
Yeah, no idea. I don't even know which study that is. And we have another one asking about you're only infectious when you're shedding the virus. So is there a test to determine if you're actually shedding the virus, or
PCR test that determines the presence of virus. The presumption is if you've got your virus up in your nose and throat, you're shedding it.
Okay.
Yeah. You know, unlike veterinary medicine, we can't take a person that's infected and experimentally put them in a room full of uninfected people deliberately and see how many people they infect. I can do that with white mice. I can't do that with people.
Yeah. And then we just have a comment from our treasurer, Greg Alexander, going out to everybody, all the participants in the chat, that if you have any disposable income, please consider donating to Humanist community to support the forum, and specifically sending a check, and we have the address in the chat. I'm not going to repeat it on the air. But yes, we do appreciate support. Since we're not meeting in person, our donations are way down. Luckily, to some respect, we're not spending as much, but we still do have some costs. So donations are appreciated. If there are no other specific questions, which I don't see anybody else's hand up. Oh, I have Jeff Justice just raised his hand in the video. You are unmuted, Jeff.
I can just comment that a week and a half ago, I got an advertisement from LabCorp, which is the second largest blood testing company in the US. And they're offering the antibody test for $10. It costs, they're using the Roche test. So I went in and got mine. And they reported the results the next day. And you can go to the Roche page and put it in the link to it in the comments. They're quoting 99.8% specificity, 100% sensitivity if it's been 2 weeks since onset of, since you recovered from the illness.
That's pretty good numbers. Wow.
Okay. I prefer if you're raising your hand to use the Zoom raise hand. It actually makes it easier for me to find you and unmute and puts everybody in order properly. If you raise your hand in the video, I'm very likely to miss it. I do have everybody's video up, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to see you. Everybody's a small little video on my screen right now. It doesn't look like we have any other questions queued up. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and allow everybody to unmute yourself so we can go into sort of the general discussion. So yeah, you'll be able to unmute yourself now, and just be aware, try not to talk over each other. If two people are talking at the same time, you can't hear anybody. So go for it.
Charlie, have there been any animal epidemics that are in any way similar to this COVID thing in terms of, how it progresses through a population, and anything we can learn from that and apply to recovering from this particular human COVID epidemic?
Was that aimed at me? I didn't. I couldn't tell.
Yeah, it was.
Okay. Don't know about human medicine. In veterinary medicine, we had a pretty good example. Right at the turn of the century, West Nile virus got into the U.S. It's one of the encephalitis virus groups, and it's mainly a virus of wild birds. And it doesn't appear to be a big thing in humans. But we watched it in veterinary medicine walk through the wild bird population. And it's particularly hard on the corvid birds, crows, ravens, and blue jays, for example. And it came, in fact, it was discovered by a veterinarian in the Bronx Zoo when she found a bunch of dead crows just dropped dead right there flying in the vicinity of the zoo. It came through in here in Florida for several years. We saw darn few crows and darn few blue jays. Now those populations have rebuilt. And when you have an epidemic come through that's pretty devastating at that level, you get what's called an epidemic, where lots of animals get sick, they die, whatever. Eventually, Mother Nature fights back, and you select for the individuals that have innate resistance, and enough people animals get infected and recover and develop immunity that it stops the transmission of disease. Then you get into a state called endemic stability. Now, the interesting thing, I've seen, again, this physician, epidemiologist, he says that to develop endemic stability in the United States with COVID virus, you're probably going to need to see some 60% of the population, maybe a little more than that, get infected and have it go through the population. And assuming that there's at least some degree of immunity that persists for a reasonable while, by then you'll have enough immune people in the population, or have killed off enough of the really susceptible people, or both, that the disease may not die out, but it'll just sort of smolder at a very, very low level. And that's called endemic stability.
Where do you think we are with respect to endemic stability with this in the
We're still in the endemic phase. I mean, quite a few states still have rising numbers of infected individuals, reporting more and more. There are a few states that seem to have gotten it under control. I know my county has done a good job of keeping it under control. We did it by the simple expedient of sending all our university students home. You get rid of 55,000 students from the University of Florida and another 20 from Santa Fe College. And they're the ones that don't pay attention to social distancing and stuff. And we have very good compliance now with social distancing and face masks. And as a result, we have a very low prevalence of infection. And I think it's probably because of exactly those factors. Now, in the fall, when the students come back, we expect it to blow up a bit. In fact, it would not surprise me if it doesn't blow up a big bit, simply because of lack of cooperation. The young seem to think they are invincible.
Mention how many people are actually in Gainesville, like the population.
The county and Gainesville is about 100,000. The entire county is about 270. I think Gainesville may be 125 now.
Yeah, so if you lose like half your population, that's going to make a big difference.
Oh yeah, you either lose them or you're talking about sending 70,000 home. Yeah, that thins things out a bit. But it really did a good job for us. We did very well compared to, say, the Miami-Dade area farther south, where you had people that were younger, a lot more crowding, and people, because of youth, just did not follow the rules like they should have, and they got slammed. Unfortunately, it was most of the older people that bore the consequences of it.
I was going to comment when I guess Ray brought up the question. There's an epidemic going through the area right now for rabbits. There's an article in the Mercury about it in the local newspaper. If you got a pet rabbit.
I don't know. I'm not aware of that one. I've been retired 7 years. I know there are several diseases that will run through rabbits periodically. Everything from tularemia to snuffles to I can name a whole bunch of diseases like that. But I'm not familiar with anything that's happening right now.
Yeah, every now and then you read about some animal that's endangered because of some disease running through the population.
Yeah.
Tasmanian devils have some kind of...
Happens a lot. Happens a lot more than you would think.
So I hear the 60% number.
Yeah.
I guess that means once 60% of people in the population have had it, then there's some kind of stability.
Yeah,
And I presume
yeah, go ahead.
that this is a proportion that increases monotonically. So what's the number now? And what's it going up per month?
That I can't tell you other than that it looks like, what do we have? A little over 1 million people, 1.3 million, I think was the last number I saw infected in the U.S. that had the disease that we know of. There are probably a number that were asymptomatic and we don't even know they had it. But let's assume there are 330 million people roughly in the U.S. and if 3.3 million have been infected, that's what, 0.1% of the U.S. population? No, 1%. Yeah.
So,
So
right
that's
now,
still way down. Yeah.
the current numbers, as I have, because I have the page up right now, it's basically 1.8 million infected in the United States.
So we're between 1% and 2% of our population has had the disease, and the vast majority of them seem to recover. What we don't know is how many other people have been exposed, had the infection but did not develop disease, had not been to a doctor because they had no reason. So there's some other unknown quantity, but they would be adding to the pool of people that have had it and will eventually get us to endemic stability. That's assuming we can't eradicate this thing entirely.
But we have to have 60%. Yeah. Well,
I just looked up this rabbit disease, and it says it is rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus type 2, or RHDV2.
Okay, that's not one I'm familiar with. I worked primarily with livestock when I was a real veterinarian, and then I got into, after my first 14 years at UF, I got into administration, and I became an administrative drone for my last 16 years. I did a little bit of work with marine mammals, but mostly I worked with livestock. And somehow I got into the dog heartworm. I did a lot of work with dog heartworm during that time. But rabbits, no.
Nobody else is asking. I don't know, Dad, if you've heard about these different studies and vaccine tests. I know we're hearing from humans trying to make a general vaccine for influenza. So they think they can target something on the influenza virus to block, make a vaccine for all influenzas or a large number of them. And
I can talk a little bit about it. I'm not super knowledgeable. The problem we have with influenza is they're antigens that the vaccines target that are on the virus, and that changes every year. The virus mutates a lot, but there is just a fixed set of these antigens, and they have to guess, okay, which strain of this virus is going to circulate this year? And usually 1 or 2 strains, maybe 3, and they put that in this year's vaccine. And if they guessed right, and they usually look at stuff in the Far East and see what's circulating there, because that's the ones that are going to tend to go to the rest of the world. And if they guess right, we get a very effective flu vaccine that year. And if something pops up that wasn't expected, then we don't. There is a fairly limited number of these. They're called H1N1. That's the particularly nasty one. Yeah, they are looking instead at looking at these, I think these are surface antigens, if I remember correctly. Can't remember for sure. They're looking to see if they can't find something that is common to all the strains of flu. And that's the holy grail. If they can find that, make a vaccine that is protective, targeting that, then you got one vaccine for flu.
Yeah, I heard rumors that they're going to try and do the same thing with coronaviruses.
This is Cheryl Spencer. I would like you to clarify something you said a few minutes ago. You said somebody could have the virus inside them, but they don't get the disease.
Yes, infection does not equal disease.
Right, so could you explain that? So the virus could be circulating in your bloodstream or wherever it is, but somehow you don't
the back
get
of your
disease.
throat. Yeah, and that's the problem. It's in the back of your throat. For whatever reason, whether you just got a very exposure to a very small number of virus particles initially, so that your immune system could get ahead of it, It may be that you've got a more robust immune system, which is why young people seem to be much less likely to become deathly ill. But for whatever reason, you don't get sick. You can still spread it in many cases, if not most. But infection does not equal disease. I had to hammer that into my veterinary students over and over again. Those are two entirely different things. And it's hard to have disease without infection with that specific disease agent. That's not going to happen. But you can have infection with the disease agent in many cases and not have disease develop. It depends on what's called, the term is virulence. The more virulent a disease agent is, the more likely infection equals disease.
What is the virulent parameter value for COVID-19? Do we know that yet?
I don't know. It's not as infectious as some of the other things. Measles is one of the worst about not virulence, but being infectious. And that's how they come up with this percent of the population that is needed to have a degree of protection until it protects the whole population. You get your endemic stability, and then eventually what we call herd immunity. It's based on how many people will one infected person normally infect. And in COVID-19, that's not a super high number compared to, say, measles. And that factor, and I think it's called an R factor. I'd have to look it up and see. I don't remember.
I think it's R naught.
That factor it will tell you, in part, is used in the calculations of how much infection do we need, what level of exposure do we need in the whole population before we get herd immunity, or what's called endemic stability.
Are those different? Is endemic stability different from herd immunity? Did I just hear you say?
Related. And with endemic stability, you still got the disease circulating around, but not at a very high level at all. It tends to come and go in waves. So you may have a disease come through and cause quite a bit of trouble. Then it goes away for a number of years. And then there's the number of people that are immune either die off or their immunity wanes or whatever. Eventually it'll come through again. And the periods in between would be your endemic stability. Herd immunity is when enough people or animals or whatever have been exposed, have developed immunity, that it protects the rest of the population. I think for measles, we need something close to the 90% or above mark. I forget the number now, but it's pretty darn high. It's one that we worry quite a bit because with the anti-vax activity, measles is just so very infectious that you don't need too many people not protected and get infected to suddenly blow it up in your face.
I understand. Sorry, I understand that there have been polls of the general public by the usual polling people who've asked them, if a COVID-19 vaccine becomes available, are you going to take it? And there's a remarkably high number who said no. Yeah. To me, disturbingly high number. I heard like 50% of the people said. Are you familiar? Is anybody familiar with this news?
Wouldn't surprise me. I mean, I'm 73 years old. I'm otherwise very healthy. I'm in the high-risk group, which is simply because of age and an aging immune system. They get a vaccine that's safe, I'm going to take it, just like I get my flu vaccine every year. And I've had enough experience with flu. I lost my brother to the first round of swine flu. That would have been 76. He died at age 26. He died of swine flu. Mm-hmm. And then the last swine flu epidemic, my former secretary spent a month in a medically induced coma in our local hospital when her kids came home with the flu, and then she got it. That's nothing to mess around with. It flu scares the bejeebers out of me because of those two episodes. And this thing is a heck of a lot deadlier than the flu. So you're darn sure if that vaccine, unless there's some serious questions about safety, I'm going to be taking it. Looking at the pictures of everybody here, we probably all ought to be taking it. Most of us have hair the same color as mine.
The people who don't want to get vaccinated are the anti-vaxxers who don't want their children vaccinated against the measles.
Yeah.
But this was a much higher percentage who said they would not. These were not. This was way beyond the normal, let's say,
and I don't
anti-vax
know what the
population
reason is behind it. I could probably get into politics. I know as I go out into rural counties, I wear a mask whenever I go inside, let's say, a convenience store or any place. And we've had people actually get harassed for wearing masks. Our county has a law that says you can't go in a public building, whether it's a private business or a government. If you're outside your home and you're going into where people are, you must wear a mask. Probably no accident we had such a low prevalence of infection in our county too, probably related to that sort of stuff. But we got good compliance, but the surrounding counties around us are very rural, and you almost never see a mask. You have a few stores where the staff are wearing masks because they're required by law, and none of the patrons. The masks protect. The best use of a mask is to keep you from spreading virus to somebody else. Masks are much more effective preventing an infected person from shedding virus out than they are preventing virus coming in. I think it's about 60% to 30%. So if you just wear a mask, you reduce your risk of getting COVID-19 a bit. And it might be, I think the number is somewhere in the 30% range. If you're sick and you wear a mask, you reduce the risk of infecting somebody else by 60 or 70%. And if both of you are wearing masks, the protection level is now up around 90%. So you wear masks as much to protect everybody else as it is to protect yourself.
I wear a mask for that reason, and I go to Trader Joe's and all the staff are wearing masks, and pretty much all the stores, CVS, whatever. My sister does not wear a mask, but she does try to maintain 6 feet of separation. She tried to get her hair cut a week or so ago, and they wouldn't let her in without a mask, so she found someplace that would let her do it without a mask.
That wouldn't be Santa Clara County, because our hair.
No, this is Arizona. This is in Arizona.
Just Charlie, our county was one of I think the first county to be locked down on March the 17th in the whole of the U.S. And we are still under lockdown. We have a public health officer who you've probably heard about, Dr. Sarah Cody, used to work at the CDC. It's a very knowledgeable person, and she is keeping us. She says she's not happy yet, even though the number of infections is going up very slowly. There's a marvelous dashboard, as they call it, that I hope the rest of you are looking at, the Santa Clara County Public Health Dashboard, which my husband and I look at every day. And they even have by postcode how many infections there have been in your postcode. So my postcode, 94306, we've had 23 infections. They don't tell us about deaths, but 23 are, and then they turn that into a number per 100,000. So we have about 27,000 people in 94306. So our rate per 100,000 is 83. Now that's considered quite low. In places like New York City, it's like over 1,000 or something like that. So anyway, just understanding your local statistics, I think, is useful. Nevertheless, I go out for my afternoon constitutional, which is all we're allowed to do. I wear a mask, even though there are only 23 people in my area, which is quite big, who've ever had it and probably don't have it anymore. Anyway, so, the chance I'm actually going to bump into somebody with it is very low, but nevertheless, I wear, actually, it's a bandana. There are actually articles out there on which materials are best. And so, for example, they found that a mixture of silk and cotton, a high-density thread cotton, added to, so you have a layer of cotton, a layer of silk, is one of the better types of masks, because apparently the silk has an electrostatic way of stopping the particles. And the cotton is more of just a plain mechanical barrier. So anyway.
What has not been made clear to me on masks the virus itself is extremely small and can get through some awfully fine weaves. However, the virus, as I understand it, it's transported when you cough or sneeze or breathe out or speak on little particles of moisture that come out, which are nowhere near as tiny. And that's what the mask is very good at intercepting. There have been some good pictures showing people with a mask on and even just a single layer of cloth and coughing or sneezing, and they light it in such a way that you can see the water droplets. And they compare with and without, and the result really makes a difference. With the social distancing, I find there's some things related to social distancing that are not quite correct. The 6 feet is a good idea, but what happens if you're downwind and it's blowing 20 knots? That makes a difference. 6 feet isn't going to do you any good. And if you're standing in the bow of a big old cruise ship and it's cruising along at 30 knots and somebody infected is standing shoulder to shoulder next to you, anything he coughs out is going right behind you in the blink of an eye, and it's probably not going to infect you. It'll get somebody farther downwind, but it won't get you. So pay attention to which way the wind is blowing. I ride bicycles a lot, and we ride in what's called a pace line. You've probably seen the bicyclists stacked up one behind the other. And some research has shown that in order to keep from spreading the virus, you need to spread that pace line out. There's a 20 to 30-foot gap between riders. Somebody was saying something. Okay.
Somebody asked a question in the Zoom chat. Does it matter that the mask is clean or used, having sneezed or coughed into it recently? I wash my mask because it's cotton and it's just a bandana. I wash it every evening and it's dry by the next morning. I think these masks, the blue ones that you buy that go over your ears, I don't think you can wash those. Are they not officially a one-time use only?
My wife has made over 1,000 masks so far. She gives them out to everybody. She'll walk into a store and hand it to the clerks if they look like they're wearing uncomfortable masks and stuff. With respect to washing, I think if you were infected, you coughed in your mask, anybody that touched that mask could potentially get the disease, so you need to treat it as something that's infectious. But then washing with soap and water kills an awful lot of stuff. People really underrate soap and water. You throw in a little bit of Clorox and bleach, and you've pretty well done it in at that point. Mainly, I wash my mask simply because I don't want to smell it after I've worn it for a day, particularly in this climate where we just sweat all the time when we step outside.
I have only one of those pleated reusable ones, and the trouble is that I have a box of them in a storage box in a storage unit, but I don't know where that box is. I know I brought a box of those from Campbell, where I used to live, but I don't know where that box is. So I've been using one that I was given at a medical clinic when I came in with one of those more cup-like fiber ones, not the N95. And the staple broke, and the little elastic band just broke off. So they gave me this other one, and I've been using it, and right now it's more dirty with my makeup than anything else, probably. I did have a COVID-19 test on the 19th because I had to have a somewhat invasive procedure the following week, and I tested negative. And I'm not thinking I'm free and clear from everything, but considering that my sister is going about without a mask, I consider myself lucky that I haven't tested positive.
Okay.
I'll point out that I posted the Santa Clara County COVID-19 dashboard in the chat for anybody who doesn't know about it and would like to take a look.
I recommend it. They tell you which assisted living facilities, how many deaths and how many cases they've had in Santa Clara County. It's like 40 or 50% of the deaths in Santa Clara County, and we only have we're up to 142 deaths since the pandemic began. About half of those have been in assisted living facilities. So it's now well recognized that they're the worst place to be, plus singing in a church choir. So we don't do that at the moment, but that's where a lot of the super spreaders were, apparently, way back in March and February, before we really understood.
With the assisted living facility, you're just talking about frail individuals who just don't have a very effective immune system. And then people that have compromised pulmonary function. Smoking is a pretty high risk factor that you're going to get into trouble with this virus as well. If you got COPD, apparently diabetics are at greater risk. I'm not sure what that relates to.
Yes, the dashboard tells you that like 90% of the deaths have had an underlying medical condition.
That's what we
gives you. The dashboard gives you the percentage by age. You can see of the cases, what ages are getting it. It's just for Santa Clara County. It's fascinating. I recommend it to everybody. And it's updated around 4 o'clock every day. And so you have to refresh. If you got it up on your web browser, you just refresh. It takes a while. There's a lot of statistics, so it takes 2 or 3 minutes to load everything. So don't give up waiting for it.
Yeah, I've noticed, I've been following that dashboard for a while, and I've noticed that, I'm looking at it right now. Today we've had like 25, or yesterday, 25 new cases.
Yeah.
Which is actually higher than it has been.
Right. Why?
I don't know, but we've been like pretty consistently under 20 new cases for a while. Right. Except like Monday, it's usually like there's a big jump on Mondays.
People are getting tested.
Yeah, I'm thinking it's tested because like you can't like get it over the weekend and have it show up that quickly. So I think people are getting tested over the weekend, so it all shows up on Monday or something like that.
It's the same thing here in Florida, the Monday jump.
Yeah.
It's only the numbers they're quoting of so it's like 2,700 or so total infections since it started are only those people who've actually been tested. So again, we don't know how many others have had it, but had it so slightly they didn't go in and nobody knew and they've not been tested. So we're down like, what I find surprising is the number who are tested positive of the, 70,000 that have been tested, we're down to like 3.9%. So people are going to be tested, and only 3.9% in Santa Clara County are currently found to be positive. And that's because they're asking grocery workers, people dealing with the public every day to be tested. And of course, the nurses and doctors are getting tested, but apparently medical doctors are sending people, because the only way to get a test is if you've got a piece of paper from a medical doctor that says you're to be tested. So the doctors are sending people to be tested who apparently are not got it. And so are they just, you've got a cold, a cough, and off you go? This has been bothering me ever since the statistics came out. How come it used to be like 6 or 7%, it's now down to 3.9% who are actually tested have it? So is it that, people are being sent to be tested not with a good reason? Is it good, Charlie, that they're sending people?
What you're saying is what's called the do something. We see it in veterinary medicine as well. In our case, each animal patient comes in has a human attached to it. The animal patient's easy to deal with. The human can be the problem. And on more than one occasion, we've just given something that's fairly innocuous just to shut the person up and get them out. There's really nothing wrong with the critter. They're convinced otherwise. So you just give them something that will do no harm. And the doctor's probably being driven crazy by some of these people, making any money off of that testing. So he'll just give them the piece of paper and get them out the door so you can see the next patient. They're getting overwhelmed with patients anyhow. Get the ones that don't need it out and at least do something to assuage their worries.
Some of
I
this
think,
might have to do with whether they have the test available. I mean, there's been so much lack of test equipment available that they've tried to not test people unless they really have, and they're showing symptoms.
But remember that
If they have to have an exam like mine where they have to be tested before they have it.
Remember that PCR test, which is the one that determines whether or not you are currently infected, is expensive and slow. It's not a test that's very suitable for screening millions and millions of people. And you can test negative today, and 2 days later, you got the virus.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, the antibody test, once they get all the bugs out of that, that's the one that will tell us a lot, I think, when we start working at the population level. Oh, we got a hand waving.
Break in. Cheryl?
yes.
Yeah, I was wondering, you said that you had to have a doctor's order to have the test. To have the just the swab test, I think anybody can go in.
Yeah, I think that's true now.
Yes, I in the past, it was, you know, it was a doctor's order. So in Santa Clara County, anybody can turn up. Well, as far as I'm concerned, we have a bunch of hypochondriacs who think they've got it and they don't. Sorry.
Yeah, I agree with Fran. There are new test centers open now. I'm not sure if they're doing the full-fledged test that Charlie's talking about or what, but they're, you know, you just make an appointment online. You don't need a doctor's recommendation, and you go in at your appointed time. And there, I know that I live on the east side of San Jose, and there's centers over here, and I think several other places too. So there's more testing being done, just independent of recommendations.
Cheryl, remember that there are asymptomatic carriers. And if you test only people with symptoms, you're certain not to be catching the asymptomatic carriers. So it's actually a criterion. One of the criteria for opening up is that the test positive rate drops to show that you're testing widely enough to catch some of the asymptomatic carriers.
Right. So this idea of contact tracing, I mean, this is the next stage, right? So somebody gets it and they have to tell somebody else. This is a public health process that exists already. You get it, and then you have to remember all the people you were with in the last probably 2 weeks now, and then they all have to be tested. I understand that. And then we have these apps, right, where people, Google and Apple iPhones keep track of where you've been and who you've been close to. And so if you get it, then there is an easy way of working out who you've seen in the close to in the last 2 weeks. And then they do have to go in and be tested.
Yes, test, isolate, trace is an efficient way to go about that. And
Right.
if our capacity to do test, isolate, trace exceeds our infection rate, then we can reduce the infection rate considerably. Or, of course, if we give up on the stay-at-home masks and physical distancing with a major opening up, then it's likely to see a rise in the infection rate. And at the present, our current test isolate trace is not even sufficient for the current rate. So I think Dr. Cody's quite wise in going slow in this county.
Right. I mean, those of us who are retired, who would be mostly at home anyway, it's not been a bother to my husband and I. What the bother was all my foreign travel that was cancelled. Right now I would be preparing to go to Oberammergau in Germany. They canceled the Passion Play this year. It happens, you know, it's supposed to happen every 10 years. This was a that suffered from the plague in the 1600s, and they made a vow to God that if that they would have a play, a passion play, every 10 years if God would prevent them from ever having the plague again. It was a compact they made, a contract they thought they were making with God. Well, it worked from 1640 until this year. Germany went on lockdown, and they looked at, you must have heard of the Oberammergau Passion Play.
Yeah.
Cast of thousands, and it lasts from May through October. People come from all over the world. I'm going because I love spectacle. I'm an atheist, but nevertheless, I love spectacle. And so my trip, they canceled the whole season. They've moved it to 2022. Anyway, one might wonder if every 10 years wasn't good enough. So anyway.
Well, I learned when I was in Italy in 1975 that one of the basilicas in Venice, it's not San Giorgio, it's the other one, I'm trying to think of it, but everybody got together in the church to thank God for saving them from the plague, and then they were all too close together and it sprang up again. Santa Maria Maggiore, I think it's out there on the Grand Canal.
Uh-huh.
I was noticing, I watched a lot of the videos from the demonstrations last night, and, they say people are wearing masks, but you see a lot of aberrations. You see the mask around their neck or below their mouth or whatever. And I saw one, it was a National Guard person that was wearing a helmet, goggles, and one of those clear plastic things down to the top of his nose, but had no mask. So there was nothing covering his mouth or his nose. And I thought that was, there might be some reaction to these demonstrations, the level of COVID, because of people are very close. They're not keeping distancing, and there's a lot of shouting and yelling and projection of virus things.
Yes.
So it's scary. Not only the violence itself, which is another matter. The COVID issue could be aggravated by this.
Yeah.
I just wanted to bring this up as a matter of interest. I'm a biochemist, and I started delving into the immune system using the very technical papers that you find on Wikipedia. And I've been astounded at how complex the immune system is. Dozens of proteins like interferons and interleukins are involved, as well as at least a half dozen different immune cells, B cells and T cells, and their interactions. And this is an amazing system. And how it works at all is really amazing to me. And we produce at least 2 different levels of immune response. And we also produce 2 levels of antibodies with lesser affinity initially. And then there's a great deal of processing that goes on for 10 days between B and T cells. And then we come out with memory cells that can convey us immunity to future diseases if these antibodies are developed. So this is really an incredible system. And I don't think there's much appreciation for how involved it is in the general public.
Yes, I read in an article, my book club, we read only science and technology books. And it said, and I found this hard to believe, that your T cells, which are the ones that are your immune cells that fight, that you have in your body a T cell for every disease that most humans have ever seen. So your body is already circulating T cells that are specific to the diseases that humans have evolved with, and then along comes this COVID-19, which is a new one, and that's why we're getting it, because we don't have the T cells ready for it. Is that your understanding, Mr. Taylor?
B memory cells are also involved in this. So yeah, they're T killer cells that will attack anything that they don't recognize itself right off the top. So it's really an amazingly complex system, and I don't pretend to really understand it because my level of study has only been several hours.
Anybody, any other questions or comments? I just want to make sure that, oh, Roy
is waving.
You can go ahead and mute yourself and start talking.
We're in 2 separate rooms, obviously.
Can you unmute yourself, Roy? Can't tell. I'll unmute you.
Unmute yourself, Roy.
There. Okay. Yeah, well, what's the question?
Oh, I thought you were waving your hand and had something to say.
Well, it's very complicated. What I have to do is make a phone call, but I have some paradigm shifts that, as I say, one of them was the use of high intensity ultraviolet, ultrasound, and possibly infrasound. I think they could do wonders on the lungs, but that we need to be tested. Somebody has the ability to do it. Actually, I have a high intensity generator, high intensity ultraviolet, that when you put it underwater, it produces fog. It's about a 100-watt intensity. So if I could find a way to connect that to my lungs, I would give it a test. But anyway, the couple of what I call paradigm shifts is I have a different way.
Roy, microphone's here.
I know that. I'll talk to her later. I have an idea how, or a proposal how COVID got started, because it's an intense human response. We know we saw in the mad cow disease, that particular disease wasn't caused by a virus, but it is intense for the cows. And I have a theory how that developed. It's a little complicated, and there's a long scenario that involved CRISPR. CRISPR is the manufacturing of the breaking of the DNA and adding little chains and stuff. And I think the one way that happened is the human has something in its body that does the CRISPR automatically at a low level, not intensity CRISPR like the genetic engineers, but it's within the body. That's my theory.
In the meeting, obviously neglect this first meeting.
Yeah, okay. Didn't mean to get too technical, Alex. We'll talk over the phone later. So yeah, I'm finished.
Okay.
Yeah, I crashed there for a minute. I was just wondering, all the descriptions of the immune system, they seem to refer to viruses. Is there a similar mechanism for germs? Is it the same thing or what? Oh, talking to the microphone. As I was saying, this for Charles, all the descriptions I hear of the immune system, they seem to refer to viruses. Do they work on germs also?
The immune system will work on just about any foreign organism or object in the body. There are certain ones are more focused towards viruses, bacteria. Then you run into some of the more complex organisms that, such as the parasites that I dealt with a lot, that actually have ways of evading the immune system to some degree. Immune system's involved in transplant rejections because it recognizes that transplanted heart is foreign, doesn't belong here, I'm going to kill it. And they have to be given medications to prevent that from happening and try to get as good a match as you can. So it targets all kinds of stuff. It's the reason I didn't study immunology. It's way too complex for me, that's for sure.
Yeah. Now, the thing about transplants also, I would imagine if you've received a transplant, they've done something to your immune system, you're probably much more susceptible to various infections. Did you ever get the body to recognize the new heart as your own?
For a while, it seems like almost all transplants eventually fail in many cases. A few of them will last a long time, but a good friend of mine that I go fishing with regularly, he was involved in a lot of the heart and lung transplants that were done at the big university hospital here, most of the ones in the state. And he figures they got a 5 to 10 year, that transplant will have a 5 to 10 year lifespan. And then they're going to either, depending on the individual, then they got to requalify again for another transplant.
Are artificial hearts and so on, they're rejected by pretty much the same mechanism?
I don't know much about them. I really don't.